Hey guys, tonight we're riding out onto the vast, lonely plains of the American West. We're going to explore one of the most enduring figures in history, the cowboy. The title of our journey tonight suggests a man who survived the brutal frontier with only two things, his horse and his gun. This is the myth. It's the image we see in movies, a solitary rider, self-sufficient, a master of his own destiny, needing nothing but his trusty steed and the colt on his hip. But the truth, as it so often is far more complex, more grueling, and infinitely more interesting. The real cowboy was almost never alone, and his survival depended on a vast and intricate web of tools, skills, unspoken rules, and, most importantly, the other men who rode beside him. His gun was often the least important tool he carried. Tonight we're going to dismantle that myth and uncover the real story of how a cowboy survived. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly fuels this channel and allows me to keep digging into these forgotten corners of history for you. And as always, I'm fascinated to know where in the world you're joining me from tonight. It's a wonderful thing to see our global community gathering for another story. Let me know in the comments your city and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, settle in, perhaps turn on a fan for that steady, calming hum, and let the noise of the modern world fade away. We are heading back to the wide-open spaces, to understand not just the man, but the entire world it took for him to endure a single day on the brutal, beautiful, and unforgiving American frontier. The myth of the American cowboy is, at its core, a myth of solitude. He is the lone rider, the man against the wilderness, a figure of profound and stoic independence. He is a silhouette against the sunset, accountable to no one but himself. This image is powerful, romantic, and almost entirely false. The historical working cowboy of the great cattle drive era was one of the least solitary figures on the frontier. His very existence and survival were predicated on being a small, functional part of a larger, highly organized, and deeply interdependent social unit, the outfit. An outfit, or trail crew, was the mobile company responsible for moving thousands of head of cattle across hundreds of miles of dangerous country. It was a temporary corporation on horseback, with a clear and rigid hierarchy. To imagine a cowboy surviving alone is like imagining a sailor surviving a long sea voyage without a ship or a crew. At the top of this hierarchy was the trail boss. He was the manager, the captain of the entire operation. He was usually an older, experienced cattleman who had made the journey many times before. He was hired by the cattle owner, or cattle baron, and was given total authority over the drive. He made all the decisions: where to camp, when to cross a river, how to handle a storm. He negotiated with any potential threats, from Native American tribes demanding a toll to farmers with freshly planted fields. His word was law, and his responsibility was immense. The success of the entire multi-million-dollar venture rested on his shoulders. Second in command, and in many ways the undisputed king of the camp itself, was the cook. Known universally as Cookie, he was far more than just a chef. He was the camp doctor, the barber, the banker who sometimes held the cowboys' wages, and the chief morale officer. He was often older, more cantankerous, and more respected than any other man save the trail boss. His chuck wagon was the heart of the outfit, the mobile headquarters from which all life flowed. To cross the cook was to risk being given the worst food, the worst chores, or simply being ostracized. His authority around the campfire was absolute. Next in the hierarchy was the wrangler. Often one of the youngest members of the crew, his sole responsibility was the remuda, the large herd of spare horses that accompanied the drive. He had to guard them, graze them, and have them ready each morning so the cowboys could change to a fresh mount. It was a crucial job, as the entire operation moved at the speed of its horses. And then there were the cowboys themselves, the hands. There would be 10 to 15 of them on a typical drive. They were the laborers, the skilled workforce. But even among them, there was a pecking order. The most experienced cowboys, the top hands, would be given the most important positions on the drive, like riding point at the head of the herd. The younger, less experienced men, the greenhorns, were given the least desirable jobs, like riding at the dusty, suffocating rear of the herd, known as the drag. This entire social structure was designed for efficiency and survival. Every man had a specific job, and the failure of one man could endanger the entire outfit. A cowboy who fell asleep on night watch could cause a stampede that might kill his comrades. A wrangler who let the remuda stray could bring the entire drive to a halt. In this environment, radical individualism was not a virtue, it was a fatal liability. The cowboy was not alone on the prairie. He was surrounded by his crewmates, day and night, for months on end. He worked with them, ate with them, and slept beside them. He depended on them for his safety, his food, and his sanity. The real story of the cowboy is not one of solitude, but of intense, enforced, and absolutely necessary community. His survival was not a matter of individual heroism, but of collective endurance. Let's put you there. The myth is gone. You are not a lone rider. You are a cowboy, a hand on a long-haul cattle drive. The year is 1878. The place is the vast, rolling prairie of western Texas. Your world has been reduced to the sky above, the earth below, and the sea of cattle around you. The day does not begin with a gentle awakening, it begins with violence. The cook, a man whose good side you try desperately to stay on, is banging a spoon against a bent dishpan, his voice a gravelly roar that cuts through the pre-dawn chill. Grub pile. Come and get it, or I'll throw it to the coyotes. You groan, every muscle in your body a dull, screaming ache. The ground beneath you is hard and unforgiving. You've been sleeping in your clothes, wrapped in a canvas bedroll, using your saddle as a pillow. The air is cold enough to see your breath, a small white cloud in the deep blue twilight. Around you, a dozen other men are doing the same, emerging from their bedrolls like weary ghosts rising from the earth. There is no privacy, no quiet moment of reflection. You pull on your boots, which are stiff with cold and dew. Stumbling towards the flickering campfire, the smells hit you. The sharp, intoxicating aroma of boiling coffee, strong and black. The sizzle of salt pork, or sobelly, frying in a cast-iron skillet. And the smell of sourdough biscuits baking in a Dutch oven nestled in the coals. This is the smell of survival, the fuel for the long day ahead. You grab a tin plate and a tin cup, get your portion, and find a spot on the ground to eat. The talk around the fire is minimal, muttered. No one is a morning person out here. You eat quickly, hunched against the cold, washing the greasy food down with the scalding, gritty coffee. As you eat, the world around you is already in motion. The trail boss is conferring with the top hands, pointing towards the horizon. The wrangler is driving the remuda, the herd of about 100 spare horses, into a temporary rope corral. The great, dark mass of the cattle herd, several thousand strong, is beginning to stir, their low murmurs, and the occasional snort creating a deep, rumbling bass note that is the constant soundtrack to your life. Your breakfast is finished in minutes. You scrape your plate clean, leaving food as an insult to the cook, and head towards the remuda. It's time to catch your mount for the day. This is a chaotic dance of men, horses, and ropes in the dim light. You throw your lariat, your loop settling over the neck of the horse you'll be riding for the morning shift. You lead him out, saddle him, and swing aboard. The sun is just beginning to crack the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink. The cattle are being pushed together, their horns clacking, their hooves churning the dew-soaked ground into mud. The air is filled with dust, the shouts of men, and the lowing of the herd. You are not a solitary hero about to embark on an adventure. You are a labourer, reporting for another 12-hour shift in the most demanding factory on earth. Your world is not one of quiet contemplation, but of constant noise, motion, and dust. You are not alone. You are surrounded by thousands of pounds of unpredictable livestock and a handful of men whose lives are inextricably tied to your own. Your horse is beneath you. Your gun is on your hip. But your survival today will depend on so much more. The romantic image of the cowboy is stripped down to its bare essentials. A man, his horse, his gun. This is a powerful, minimalist fantasy. The reality was that a working cowboy was a walking, riding toolkit, and every piece of gear he wore or carried had a specific life or death function. Let's take a detailed inventory of the real equipment that allowed a cowboy to survive. The saddle. We start here because for a cowboy the saddle was more important than his horse, his gun, or anything else he owned, save the clothes on his back. A man's horse belonged to the outfit, but his saddle was his own. It was the single most expensive piece of equipment he would ever buy, often costing 2 or 3 months' wages. He would choose it with infinite care, and it would be his constant companion for his entire working life. The Western saddle was a heavy, complex piece of machinery. It was not designed for speed or comfort in the way an English saddle is. It was designed to be a mobile workbench. The sturdy saddle horn was not a handle for the rider, but an anchor for his rope. The deep seat and high cantle provided stability when a 2,000-pound steer was fighting on the other end of his lariat. The wide stirrups allowed him to stand and absorb shock. It was a tool designed to withstand incredible stress, and a good saddle could mean the difference between controlling a beast and being dragged to your death. The rope, lariat. If the saddle was the workbench, the lariat was the cowboy's primary hand tool. Made of tightly braided rawhide or grass, it was stiff and heavy, designed to hold a loop open and be thrown with accuracy. A cowboy practiced with his rope constantly, in the same way a swordsman would practice with his blade. He used it for everything: roping a fresh mount from the remuda, catching a calf for branding, pulling a steer out of a muddy bog, or even stringing up a clothesline at camp. A man's skill with a rope was the true measure of his worth as a cowboy. The clothes, as equipment. A cowboy's clothing was not fashion, it was personal protective equipment. The hat. The wide-brimmed Stetson, or boss of the plains, was the most versatile tool of all. It was a sunshade in the summer, and kept his head warm in the winter. It was a water bucket for him or his horse. It was a pillow at night. It was a fan to coax a campfire to life. Waving it, he could turn a stampeding steer. Its high crown provided insulation, creating a pocket of cool air in the heat. The bandana. This simple square of cloth, usually red or blue, was a respirator. Tied over the nose and mouth, it filtered out the choking dust kicked up by the herd, especially for the men riding drag. It could also be a sweatband, a bandage for a wound, a tourniquet, a pot holder, or a signal flag. Chaps, chaparejos. These leather leggings, worn over the trousers, were armor. They protected a rider's legs from thorny brush, cactus, snake bites, and the chafing of the saddle during long hours of riding. The boots. Cowboy boots were not designed for walking. Their high heel was designed to prevent the foot from slipping through the stirrup, which could be a fatal mistake if a man was thrown. The pointed toe helped guide the foot into the stirrup quickly. Their tight fit and smooth sole allowed a man to easily pull his foot free in a fall. Walking any distance in them was a painful, clumsy affair. The slicker. This was a long, yellow coat made of canvas that had been waterproofed with linseed oil. It was heavy, smelly, and stiff, but in a sudden downpour or a snowstorm, it was the only thing that stood between a cowboy and life-threatening exposure. It was usually tied behind his saddle, ready at a moment's notice. The bedroll. This was the cowboy's portable home. It consisted of several wool blankets wrapped in a heavy canvas tarp. The canvas kept out the dampness from the ground and the dew from the air. At night he would unroll it, place his saddle at one end for a pillow, and crawl in. It was his only private space, his only protection against the cold of the prairie night. Looking at this inventory, we see a different picture emerge. The cowboy was not a minimalist. He was a highly specialized laborer, and his survival depended on this full complement of carefully designed, functional gear. His horse and gun were part of the kit, but without his saddle, his rope, his hat, and his bedroll, he would not have lasted a single week on the trail. The image of a cowboy and his one faithful horse, a singular, named companion like Roy Rogers' Trigger or the Lone Ranger's Silver, is one of the most beloved tropes of the West. It speaks of a deep, almost mystical bond between man and beast. The reality, once again, was far more practical and far less romantic. A working cowboy on a cattle drive did not have a horse. He was assigned a string of horses from the outfit's herd, known as the remuda. The remuda was a mobile stable, a herd of anywhere from 50 to over 100 horses that accompanied the cattle drive. The word itself comes from the Spanish for remount. Each cowboy in the outfit would be assigned a string of anywhere from 6 to 10 of these horses for his personal use during the drive. The horses belonged to the cattle owner, not the cowboy. They were living tools, provided for the job. Why so many horses? Because the work was too grueling for a single animal. A horse could not endure 12 hours of hard riding, day after day, for months on end. To keep the mounts fresh and effective, a cowboy would typically ride 2 or 3 different horses in a single day. He might start the morning on a tough, energetic horse for the initial gathering of the herd, switch to a steadier, more placid mount for the long, slow miles of the afternoon, and then select another horse for his 2-hour shift on night watch. These horses were not interchangeable. An experienced cowboy knew the personalities, strengths, and weaknesses of every horse in his string. They were specialists, each suited for a particular task. A man's ability to choose the right horse for the right job was a key part of his skill set. Using a clumsy trail horse to try and cut a calf from the herd would be inefficient and dangerous. Using a high-strung, nervous horse for night duty would be asking for a stampede. The man in charge of the remuda was the wrangler, or on some outfits, the horse rustler, a term that had not yet taken on its criminal meaning. The wrangler's job was to keep the horse herd together, move them along with the main cattle drive, and have them corralled each morning and evening so the cowboys could catch their mounts. It was a position of great responsibility, often given to a younger, less experienced member of the crew who was good with horses but not yet a top hand. The daily ritual of catching a new mount was a cornerstone of trail life. The wrangler would create a temporary corral by stretching a single long rope between the chuck wagon and a stake or another man. The remuda would be driven into this simple enclosure. The cowboys would then take their lariats and, one by one, rope the horse they needed. This was a moment of skill and chaos, as horses milled and dodged in the confined space. The cowboy's relationship with the horses in his string was professional, not sentimental. He would rarely name them. He would care for them, checking their hooves for stones and their backs for sores, because his own life depended on their well-being. But there was little room for the kind of emotional attachment we see in the movies. These were work animals, and at the end of the drive, he would part with them without ceremony. His saddle was his personal property. The horses were company assets. This system, pragmatic and efficient, ensured that the drive always had a supply of fresh, capable horsepower, the living engine that drove the great herds of the West. Among the specialists in a cowboy's string, one horse stood apart. It was the most intelligent, the most highly trained, and the most valuable animal in the remuda, the cutting horse. This was not just a mount, it was a partner, an animal with an innate understanding of cattle that bordered on the supernatural. The art of cutting, separating a single cow from the herd, was one of the most difficult and essential skills on the ranch or the trail, and it was a dance that was impossible without a brilliant cutting horse. Imagine the scene. A herd of 1,000 cattle stands pressed together, a dense, shifting mass of horns and hides. The trail boss needs to separate a specific steer, perhaps one that is sick, or one that needs to be branded. A cowboy on an ordinary horse would have to fight his way into the herd, creating chaos and agitating the other animals. But a top hand on a good cutting horse would approach the task with the quiet confidence of a master surgeon. He would ride his horse slowly into the herd, making his way towards the target animal. Once he had cut the steer out from its neighbours, the real work began, and it was the horse, not the rider, who took control. The cowboy would slacken the reins, giving the horse its head. From that moment on, the horse was in charge. The steer, instinctively wanting to return to the safety of the herd, would dodge and feint. The cutting horse would mirror its every move with breathtaking agility. It would drop low, zigzag, and stop on a dime, always keeping its body between the steer and the herd. This was not a matter of the rider guiding it. The horse was thinking, anticipating, and reacting on its own. It had what was known as cow sense, an innate ability to read a cow's intentions and counter them. This cow sense was partly a result of breeding certain lines of horses, like the American quarter horse, were known for it, but it was also the result of years of careful training. A good cutting horse was an incredible investment of time and expertise. It learned its trade through experience, starting as a young horse working alongside a seasoned veteran. The bond between a cowboy and his favourite cutting horse was the closest the frontier ever came to the myth of the man and his one special steed. While most horses in his string were interchangeable, a man's cutting horse or branding horse was a prized possession. A trail boss might have his own personal cutting horse that no one else was allowed to ride. These animals were so valuable that their well-being was a top priority. They were not used for the grueling day-to-day work of the trail, but were saved for the specific, delicate tasks where their unique intelligence was required. Watching a good cutting horse work was a form of artistry. It was a silent conversation between horse, rider, and cow, a display of athletic grace and incredible animal intelligence. The rider sat almost still, a quiet anchor in the saddle, while the horse performed its intricate high-speed ballet. This was the horse that came closest to being a true partner. It was a specialist, a four-legged genius whose skills were essential for managing the great herds. It was the living proof that survival in the West depended not just on brute force, but on a deep, intuitive understanding of the animals that were at the heart of the cowboy's world. The cutting horse was not just a tool, it was the brains of the operation. The prairie at night was a different world. The vast, sun-bleached landscape of the day dissolved into an endless, inky blackness, filled with unfamiliar sounds and unseen dangers. For the cowboys on a cattle drive, the night was the time of greatest anxiety. The herd, usually placid during the day, became nervous and spooky in the dark. A sudden noise, the howl of a coyote, a clap of distant thunder, the stumble of a horse could trigger a catastrophic stampede. The crucial task of keeping the herd calm fell to the men on night watch, and their success depended almost entirely on the quality of their mount, the night horse. A cowboy's night horse was chosen with extreme care. It was not the fastest or the most agile horse in his string. It was the calmest, the steadiest, and the most reliable. A night horse had to be virtually unflappable. It had to be sure-footed in the dark, able to navigate a landscape riddled with prairie dog holes and unseen obstacles without stumbling. It had to have excellent night vision and a placid temperament that wouldn't be spooked by the strange shadows and sounds of the night. The night watch was a lonely 2-hour shift. 2 cowboys would ride in slow, opposite circles around the sleeping herd, a perimeter of quiet vigilance. Their primary tool was not their gun, but their voice. They would sing. The songs were not for their own entertainment, they were for the cattle. The cowboys would sing low, monotonous, and repetitive songs, often old ballads or hymns. The constant, gentle sound of the human voice had a hypnotic, calming effect on the herd. It became part of the natural soundscape of the night, masking the other, more startling noises that might cause a panic. The content of the songs didn't matter. It was the steady, soothing rhythm that kept the peace. During this long, slow circle, the cowboy and his night horse developed a unique and intimate bond. The man had to trust his horse completely. He had to trust that it wouldn't shy at a snake or a tumbleweed. He had to rely on the horse's superior senses to detect danger long before he could. The horse, in turn, had to trust the rider's gentle guidance and calm presence. But if the unthinkable happened, if the herd did stampede, the night horse had to transform from a placid walker into a courageous, all-out racer. The moment the ground began to tremble, the cowboy's only goal was to get to the head of the thundering herd and try to turn the lead steers, forcing the entire mass of animals to run in a giant circle until they exhausted themselves. This was a desperate, terrifying ride in total darkness. The rider was flying blind, trusting his horse to navigate the treacherous ground at a full gallop, avoiding collisions with the panicked cattle. A single misstep by the horse meant instant death for both of them. A good night horse was worth its weight in gold. A cowboy would know which horse in his string could be trusted with this immense responsibility. He would save that horse, ensuring it was well rested for the night's work. The relationship was built on a foundation of mutual trust and shared vulnerability. In the profound darkness of the prairie, miles from any semblance of safety, the cowboy and his night horse were a single, vigilant entity. They were the quiet guardians, the lonely sentinels whose steady presence stood between the sleeping camp and absolute disaster. While the cutting horse was the specialist and the night horse was the guardian, the bulk of a cowboy's string was made up of the unglamorous, hard-working rank and file, the trail horse and the rope horse. These were the equine labourers, the mounts that endured the endless, monotonous miles, and the brute force work that defined the cattle drive. Their story is not one of dramatic intelligence or quiet heroism, but of sheer, stubborn endurance. The trail horse, sometimes called a circle horse, was the backbone of the daily operation. This was the mount a cowboy used for the long, slow hours of riding flank or drag, keeping the edges of the herd in line. The job was not glamorous. It was a mind-numbing routine of riding back and forth, nudging a stray steer, and eating dust. A trail horse didn't need to be brilliant or fast, it needed to be tough. It had to have incredible stamina, the ability to walk for 10 hours a day under a hot sun with only brief rests. It had to have a calm, plodding disposition, untroubled by the constant noise and movement of the herd. It had to be sturdy, with strong legs and hard hooves that could withstand the constant pounding on the rough terrain. These were the blue-collar workers of the Remuda. They were often not the most beautiful or well-bred horses, but they were dependable. A cowboy might ride 2 or 3 different trail horses in a single day, constantly rotating them to keep them from breaking down under the strain. His own physical comfort and his ability to do his job depended on the simple, uncomplaining endurance of these animals. Then there was the rope horse. While the cutting horse was used for the delicate work of separating a single animal, the rope horse was built for strength. This was the horse a cowboy rode when he needed to rope a full-grown steer or pull a bogged-down cow from a muddy riverbank. This work required a horse that was strong, steady, and courageous. When a cowboy roped a struggling 1,000-pound animal, the force exerted on the saddle and the horse was immense. A rope horse had to be able to plant its feet, lean back, and hold its ground against a powerful, panicked beast. It had to be intelligent enough to keep the rope taut, preventing the roped animal from getting tangled or charging. It had to be unafraid of the chaos of a branding session, with the smell of burning hair and the bawling of calves. A good rope horse was a prized asset. It was often a bigger, more muscular horse than the other animals in the string. A cowboy would come to know his rope horse's strength and trust it implicitly in a dangerous situation. The partnership was one of brute force and calculated risk. The cowboy provided the skill with the lariat, but it was the horse that provided the raw power needed to control the captured animal. Together, the trail horse and the rope horse performed the vast majority of the work on the drive. Their contribution was not as dramatic as that of the cutting horse or the night horse, but it was just as essential. They were the equine infantry, the animals that absorbed the daily punishment of the trail. The success of the entire enterprise was built on their strong backs, their sturdy legs, and their incredible, uncelebrated capacity for endurance. They were the quiet, forgotten workhorses that truly carried the weight of the West. Not every horse in the remuda was a gentle, cooperative partner. The herd was constantly being replenished with new, unbroken horses, known as broncos or broncs. These were wild or semi-wild animals, often captured directly from the open range, that had never felt the weight of a saddle or the hand of a man. The process of turning these raw, explosive animals into usable saddle horses was one of the most violent, dangerous, and essential rituals of ranch life. This was the work of the bronco buster. The term horsebreaking is a literal one. The goal was not to gently tame the horse through patience and understanding, as a modern trainer would. The goal was to break its spirit, to dominate it through a terrifying display of force and endurance, teaching it that resistance was futile. The process usually began in a round corral. The bronc, wild-eyed and terrified, would be roped and dragged into the enclosure. A saddle would be cinched onto its back, an act that often sent the horse into a frenzy of bucking and kicking. Then came the moment of truth. The bronco buster, a man chosen for his exceptional strength, balance, and sheer nerve, would have to get on its back. This was often achieved by blindfolding the horse or holding its head to the ground. The rider would slip into the saddle, get a firm grip on the reins or a simple rope, and signal for the horse to be released. What followed was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated violence. The horse would explode. It would leap, twist, buck, and spin in a desperate, frantic attempt to throw the man from its back. The rider's job was simply to stay on. He would clamp his legs tight, absorb the bone-jarring impacts, and ride out the storm, sometimes raking the horse's sides with his spurs to both punish it and keep himself seated. This was not the stylized 8-second ride of a modern rodeo. This could go on for many minutes, a brutal contest of wills between man and beast. The goal was to ride the horse to a point of complete exhaustion, to a point where it was too tired to buck anymore. Once the horse stood still, trembling and lathered in sweat, the first lesson was over. The man had won. This process would be repeated day after day, with each ride becoming slightly less violent, until the horse learned that bucking was not an option. This was an incredibly dangerous job. A bronco buster could be thrown with tremendous force, resulting in broken bones, a crushed skull, or a broken neck. He could be trampled, kicked, or bitten. It was a profession with a very short career span. The men who did this work were a unique breed. They were often itinerants who traveled from ranch to ranch, selling their specialized and perilous skills. They were revered for their courage, but also seen as a bit wild themselves. The result of this process was not a happy, trusting partner. It was a broken horse. It was an animal that had learned to submit to human authority out of fear and exhaustion. Many of these horses remained unpredictable and could revert to their old ways if startled or pushed too hard. These were the salty or outlaw horses that were a constant challenge even for experienced cowboys. The brutal ritual of breaking the bronc is a stark reminder of the frontier's relationship with the natural world. It was not a relationship of gentle harmony. but one of domination. Nature, in the form of the wild horse, was a force to be conquered, to be broken to the will of man. It was a violent, necessary, and deeply revealing process, a microcosm of the larger struggle to impose human order on an untamed land. It is impossible to tell the true story of the American cowboy without paying tribute to his direct ancestor and teacher, the Mexican vaquero. The entire culture of the open-range cattle industry, from the tools and techniques to the very language used to describe them, was not invented in Texas or Kansas. It was inherited from a rich tradition of horsemanship and cattle handling that had existed in Spanish America for centuries. The vaquero was the original cowboy, and his legacy is woven into the very fabric of the West. When the Spanish conquistadors brought cattle and horses to the New World in the 16th century, they created the foundation for a new way of life. In the vast open rangelands of what is now Mexico and the American Southwest, a unique culture developed around the management of these huge herds. The men who did this work were the vaqueros, a term derived from the Spanish word for cow, vaca. Over the next 300 years, the vaqueros perfected the skills of working cattle from horseback. They were masters of the rope, developing a distinctive style of roping that was both elegant and effective. They designed the tools that would become the standard equipment of the American cowboy. The heavy, functional saddle with its prominent horn, the braided rawhide lariat, the protective leather chaps, the high-heeled boots, the wide-brimmed hat, all of these were vaquero innovations, developed and refined over generations of hard-won experience. Even the cowboy's vocabulary is a testament to this heritage. Lariat comes from lariata. Chaps is short for chaparejos. Rodeo is the Spanish word for roundup. Remuda comes from the Spanish for remount. Wrangler is believed to be a corruption of the Spanish caballerango, the man in charge of the horses. Buckaroo, another name for a cowboy, is an anglicization of vaquero itself. When Anglo-American settlers began to move into Texas in the early 19th century, they did not invent a cattle industry. They adopted one. Young Texans learned the trade from their Mexican neighbors. They learned how to ride, how to rope, and how to manage cattle on the open range from the vaqueros who had been doing it for centuries. The first great cattle drives were often a collaboration between Anglo, Mexican, and African-American cowboys, a blending of cultures and skills. The vaquero tradition was the bedrock upon which the entire cattle kingdom was built. However, as the 19th century progressed, and as conflict between the United States and Mexico grew, this heritage was often deliberately obscured. In the popular mythology of the West that began to form, the cowboy was recast as a purely Anglo-American hero. The Mexican and African-American contributions to this culture were largely erased, a historical whitewashing that has only recently begun to be corrected. But the legacy remains, etched into the gear, the language, and the fundamental skills of the cowboy. He was not a spontaneous creation of the American prairie. He was the heir to a long and proud tradition, a tradition born in the sun-drenched plains of New Spain. To understand the cowboy, we must first acknowledge the vaquero, the quiet, masterful horseman whose expertise and ingenuity made the entire epic of the American cattle drive possible. We now turn to the second half of our mythical cowboy's survival kit, his gun. The six-shooter, the Colt Peacemaker, the gun that won the West. It is the most potent symbol of the cowboy, the tool of justice, the great equalizer. In the movies, it is an extension of the hero's hand, a magical wand that delivers flawless, instantaneous justice. The reality of the 19th century revolver was far less impressive. It was a clumsy, unreliable, and surprisingly difficult weapon to use effectively. The standard sidearm of the post-Civil War era was the single-action revolver. The most famous was the 1873 Colt Single-Action Army, also known as the Peacemaker. Its design was revolutionary for its time, as it used self-contained metallic cartridges instead of the older, messy cap-and-ball system. But single action is the key. To fire the weapon, a man had to perform two distinct actions for every single shot. First, he had to manually pull back the hammer with his thumb, and second, he had to pull the trigger. This made truly rapid fire impossible. A man could not simply empty his gun by pulling the trigger. The rhythmic motion of cockfire, was the fastest he could go. The movie image of a gunslinger fanning the hammer, holding the trigger and slapping the hammer with his palm was a real technique, but it was a desperate, close-range tactic that sacrificed all semblance of accuracy for speed. It was a way to fill a room with lead and smoke, not to hit a specific target. Furthermore, these early revolvers were notoriously inaccurate. The sights were primitive, usually just a simple groove on the top of the frame and a blade at the end of the barrel. The heavy trigger pull and the mechanics of the rotating cylinder meant that hitting anything beyond a few yards was a matter of considerable luck. The idea of a cowboy making a precise, long-distance shot with a revolver is pure fiction. The revolver was a short-range defensive weapon, effective at the distance of a card table, but almost useless at 50 paces. Reliability was also a constant issue. The complex internal mechanism was vulnerable to the dust and dirt of the frontier. A fouled or poorly maintained revolver could easily misfire or jam at the critical moment. And then there was the loading process. The Colt Peacemaker did not have a swing-out cylinder like a modern revolver. To load it, a man had to open a small loading gate on the side of the frame, insert one cartridge, rotate the cylinder by hand, insert the next, and so on for all 6 chambers. It was a slow, deliberate process. To eject the spent cartridges, he had to use a spring-loaded ejector rod to push them out, one by one. Reloading in the middle of a fight was a virtual impossibility. A man had 6 shots, and if that wasn't enough, he was in serious trouble. For safety reasons, most cowboys and lawmen carried their revolver with the hammer resting on an empty chamber. The firing pin was attached directly to the hammer, and a sharp jolt like falling from a horse could cause the gun to discharge if the hammer was resting on a live round. This meant that a man's 6-shooter was, in practice, a 5-shooter. The revolver was a revolutionary piece of technology for its time. It offered a man 5 or 6 shots of portable, repeating firepower. But it was not a magic talisman. It was a crude mechanical device that required skill, practice, and a great deal of luck to use effectively. The real-life gunslinger was not a man with supernatural speed and accuracy, but a man who understood the severe limitations of his weapon and knew how to use it to his advantage in a close, brutal, and desperate fight. The most significant myth we need to dismantle about the cowboy's gun is its purpose. In the legend, the gun is almost exclusively a weapon for fighting other men. In the day-to-day reality of the cowboy's life, his revolver was a multi-purpose tool, and its use in interpersonal conflict was by far its rarest application. For the working cowboy on a long cattle drive, his gun was part of his equipment, just like his rope and his hat, and it had a variety of practical, non-violent jobs. One of its most common uses was as a signaling device. On the vast, open prairie, where men could be spread out over a mile, a gunshot was the loudest and most effective way to communicate. A single shot might signal danger. A specific number of shots might be a pre-arranged signal to the trail boss or the chuck wagon. In the chaos of a stampede, where verbal commands were useless against the thunder of hooves, gunshots could be used to help turn the herd or to alert the rest of the outfit to the direction of the run. The gun was also a tool for managing livestock. A cowboy would never intentionally shoot a cow. They were valuable assets, but he would often have to put an animal out of its misery. A steer with a hopelessly broken leg, or a horse that had been gored by another animal, could not be left to suffer a slow, agonizing death. A single, merciful bullet was the most humane solution. This was a grim but necessary part of the job. It was also an essential tool for dealing with predators and pests. The prairie was full of things that could harm the herd or the cowboys themselves. Rattlesnakes were a constant threat, both on the ground and sometimes in a cowboy's bedroll. A quick shot from a revolver was often the safest way to dispatch a snake from a short distance. While wolves and coyotes rarely attacked a full-grown steer, they were a danger to newborn calves. A cowboy on watch would use his gun to drive away these predators. In some regions, larger animals like bears or cougars could be a threat, and a cowboy's revolver, while not ideal, was his primary means of self-defense. The gun could even be a tool of convenience. A cowboy might use his revolver to start a fire if his matches were wet, by firing a blank cartridge into a pile of dry tinder. While certainly a dramatic method, it speaks to the utilitarian view of the firearm. This is not to say that the gun was never used for self-defense against other humans. The West was a dangerous place, and a cowboy traveling alone or in a small group was vulnerable to robbery. The revolver was a deterrent, a visible sign that he was not an easy target. But actual instances of a working cowboy on the trail getting into a gunfight were exceedingly rare. His primary concerns were the cattle, the weather, and the terrain. The image of the gunslinger cowboy is largely a product of what happened at the end of the trail, in the volatile cattle towns. On the long drive itself, the cowboy was a laborer, not a fighter. His gun was just another tool in his kit, used far more often to kill a snake than to kill a man. Understanding this shifts our perspective entirely. The gun was not a symbol of his prowess in combat, but another piece of the complex equipment required to do a very difficult and dangerous job. While the cowboy's revolver served primarily as a tool, we cannot ignore its role as a weapon. The frontier was a violent place, and there were times when a man's survival depended on his willingness and ability to use his gun against another human being. However, these instances were governed by a reality far removed from the choreographed duels of Hollywood. When a cowboy did draw his gun on another person, it was almost always in a situation that was sudden, chaotic, and brutally close. The most common venue for such violence was the saloon. After months of privation on the trail, cowboys would descend on the cattle towns with money in their pockets and a powerful thirst for release. In the crowded, smoky, and alcohol-fueled environment of the saloon, trivial disputes could escalate with terrifying speed. An argument over a card game was a classic catalyst. Gambling was rampant, and accusations of cheating were common. With large amounts of cash and pride on the table, a simple disagreement could turn deadly in seconds. A perceived insult, a bump in a crowded room, a rivalry over a dance hall girl, any of these could be the spark. In these situations, there was no formal challenge, no stepping out into the street. The fight would erupt right there, among the tables and the panicked crowd. It would be a desperate, clumsy affair. Men would pull their revolvers and start shooting at point-blank range. They would not be aiming carefully. They would be trying to get a shot off before their opponent did. The room would instantly fill with a deafening roar and a thick cloud of black powder smoke. Men would be shooting blind, reacting to muzzle flashes in the haze. Bystanders would be diving for cover, and it was not uncommon for innocent people to be hit by stray bullets. Self-defense on the trail was a different matter. A cowboy traveling alone, perhaps carrying his wages after a drive, was a tempting target for road agents or hold-up men. In such an encounter, the element of surprise was key. The robber would try to get the drop on the cowboy, appearing suddenly with his own gun drawn. The cowboy's only hope was to react instantly, either by surrendering or by trying to draw his own weapon in a desperate gamble. There was no code of honor here. It was a simple, brutal calculation of risk. The gun was also a tool of intimidation. A man might draw his weapon not with the intent to shoot, but to end an argument, to back down an opponent without bloodshed. This was a dangerous game. Pulling a gun was a final, non-negotiable statement. If the other man didn't back down, you were committed to a course of action from which there was no retreat. It is also important to note the legal ramifications. While the law was often distant, it was not entirely absent. A man who killed another, even in what he claimed was a fair fight, could face a murder charge. The line between self-defense and murder was often blurry and subject to the interpretation of a local judge or jury who might be swayed by the social standing of the men involved. Killing a man, even a no-good drifter, was a serious matter with potentially life-altering consequences. So while the gun was indeed a part of the cowboy's defensive arsenal, its use as a weapon was a moment of ultimate failure. It represented the breakdown of all other options. It was a descent into a chaos that no one, no matter how skilled or lucky, could be certain of surviving. The wise cowboy understood that the best gunfight was the one that was avoided. The gun on his hip was a last resort, a tool for a moment of terrifying desperation in a world where desperation was never far away. The revolver, with its iconic place on the cowboy's hip, has so dominated our image of the West that we often forget about his other, and in many ways more practical, firearm, the rifle. While the pistol was a weapon for close-quarters emergencies, the rifle was the tool for the real, day-to-day business of survival at a distance. It was the firearm a cowboy relied on for hunting, for long-range defense, and for dealing with threats that his six-shooter simply couldn't reach. The rifle was not typically carried on the man. It was too long and cumbersome. Instead, it was kept in a leather scabbard attached to his saddle. It was a tool of the horseman, not the pedestrian. When a cowboy was riding the open range, his rifle was always within easy reach. The great technological leap of the era was the repeating rifle. Prior to the Civil War, most rifles were single-shot, muzzle-loading affairs that were slow and difficult to reload. The invention of the lever-action repeating rifle changed everything. The most famous of these was the Winchester. The Winchester Model 1866, known as the Yellow Boy for its brass frame, and its more famous successor, the Model 1873, were robust, reliable, and could hold more than a dozen cartridges in a tubular magazine under the barrel. A man could fire off a succession of shots as fast as he could work the lever, a tremendous advantage. The Winchester 1873 was so popular and effective that it became known as the gun that won the West, a title it arguably deserves more than the Colt Peacemaker. One of its greatest advantages was that it was often chambered in the same caliber as the Colt revolver, like the .44-40 cartridge. This meant a cowboy only had to carry one type of ammunition for both his rifle and his pistol, a huge logistical advantage on the trail. The primary use of the rifle was hunting. While the food on a cattle drive was notoriously monotonous, a cowboy with a rifle could supplement the diet of beans and bacon with fresh meat. A well-aimed shot could bring down a deer, an antelope, or a buffalo, providing a welcome and much-needed source of protein for the entire outfit. The rifle was also the superior weapon for defense at a distance. When dealing with predators like a wolf pack or a grizzly bear, the greater power and range of a rifle were far preferable to a revolver, and when it came to human conflict, the rifle was the true killer. In the rare instances of a pitched battle between, for example, a posse and a gang of outlaws, the fight was almost always dominated by rifles, not pistols. Men would take cover at a distance of 100 yards or more and exchange fire. In this kind of fight, the revolver was useless. The man with the Winchester was king. The famous range wars, like the Johnson County War in Wyoming, were essentially small-scale military conflicts fought with repeating rifles. However, the working cowboy on a cattle drive was not a soldier. His rifle was part of his kit, but it was used with care. Like revolver cartridges, rifle ammunition was expensive, and a man would not waste it on casual target practice. Every shot had a purpose. The rifle represents a more realistic and less romantic aspect of the cowboy's life. It was not a dueling weapon, it was a tool for providing food and for dealing with serious, distant threats. It was the firearm of the pragmatist, not the showman. While the revolver on his hip created the legend, it was often the rifle in his scabbard that ensured his survival. In the world of the cowboy, a gun was useless without two things: ammunition to feed it and the constant care required to keep it working. These mundane realities are completely absent from the myths, where guns never jam and bullets are infinite. The practical considerations of ammunition and maintenance were a constant and crucial part of a cowboy's relationship with his firearms. Ammunition in the 19th century was expensive and often heavy. For a working cowboy on a limited wage, buying cartridges was a significant expense. He did not have an unlimited supply. A box of 50 rifle or pistol cartridges could cost $1 or more, which might be a full day's pay. As a result, every single bullet was a valuable commodity. This economic reality is one of the main reasons why the idea of cowboys constantly engaging in casual gunplay is a fiction. A man was not going to waste his precious, expensive ammunition on shooting at bottles or cans for fun. He conserved his cartridges for when he truly needed them for hunting, for signaling, or for a life-or-death emergency. When a cowboy rode into town at the end of a drive, one of his first stops at the general store or hardware store would be to replenish his supply of ammunition. The logistics of carrying ammunition also had to be considered. A cowboy would carry the cartridges for his revolver in a cartridge belt, a leather belt with woven loops to hold each individual round. These belts were not the double rigs filled with hundreds of rounds that we see in the movies. A typical belt might hold 20 to 30 cartridges, which was more than enough for a man who hoped never to have to use them. The great advantage, as mentioned, was for a cowboy to have a rifle and a revolver that used the same ammunition, such as the .44-40 Winchester Colt combination. This simplified his supply chain immensely. He only had to buy and carry one type of cartridge for both of his firearms. Beyond ammunition, there was the constant, necessary chore of gun care. The environment of the West was brutal on mechanical devices. The fine dust of the prairie could work its way into the intricate mechanism of a revolver or rifle, causing it to gum up and fail. The dampness from rain or river crossings could cause rust. Black powder, the propellant used in 19th century cartridges, was notoriously corrosive and left a thick, dirty residue after firing. A man who depended on his firearm for survival had to be a diligent mechanic. Whenever he had a spare moment at camp, he would break down his weapons. He would carefully disassemble his revolver, using a small screwdriver, and a rag to wipe down every single part, the cylinder, the hammer, the trigger mechanism, cleaning away the dust and grime. He would then apply a light coat of gun oil to prevent rust before reassembling it. Cleaning a rifle was an even more involved process. He would use a cleaning rod with a patch of cloth to swab out the long barrel, removing the black powder fouling that could build up and affect accuracy. This was not a glamorous task. It was tedious, repetitive maintenance, but it was absolutely essential. A jammed gun at the wrong moment was a death sentence. A cowboy's life could depend on a single, well-oiled spring or a clean barrel. This practical reality of cost and care paints a very different picture of the gun-toting cowboy. He was not a reckless gunslinger, blazing away with unlimited ammunition. He was a frugal, practical man who understood that his firearms were delicate and expensive tools. He treated them with respect, cared for them with diligence, and used them with a conservative reluctance born of economic necessity and a deep understanding of their mechanical limitations. A cowboy could survive without his gun. He could not survive without the cook. The heart of the entire cattle drive, the mobile headquarters, the rolling sanctuary in a vast and hostile wilderness, was the chuck wagon. And the man who ruled it, the cookie, was the most important and respected figure in the entire outfit, save for the trail boss himself. The chuck wagon was a brilliant piece of frontier innovation, credited to the rancher Charles Goodnight. He took a sturdy, surplus army wagon and modified it for the specific needs of the trail. At the back, he built a chuck box, a cabinet with a hinged lid that folded down to create a workbench. This box had numerous small drawers and compartments to hold spices, coffee, flour, and other staples, protecting them from the elements. The wagon itself was loaded with barrels of water, sacks of beans and flour, and the cowboy's personal bedrolls. A canvas sheet was stretched over the top, and a possum belly, a canvas sling underneath, carried firewood or cow chips for fuel. The man in charge of this domain, the cook, was a unique character. He was often older than the cowboys, and frequently a veteran of previous drives or even the Civil War. He was notoriously cranky, cantankerous, and dictatorial. His authority around the campfire was absolute. There were unwritten laws of the chuck wagon that no cowboy dared break. You never tied your horse to the wagon wheel. You always approached the fire from the downwind side, so you didn't blow dust into the food. And you never ever complained about the cooking. The cook's day was the longest and hardest of anyone's. He was up hours before the cowboys, grinding coffee and starting the sourdough for the biscuits. He would cook breakfast, clean up, and then have to pack the entire kitchen back into the wagon. He would then drive the wagon ahead of the herd, navigating by instinct and experience, to select the next campsite, usually near water. When he arrived, he would unpack everything again, gather fuel, and start preparing the evening meal. He would be the last one to go to sleep. The food he prepared was monotonous but calorie-dense, designed to fuel men engaged in hard physical labor. Sourdough biscuits. This was the staple. The cook carried a precious keg of sourdough starter, which he nurtured like a child. Every day, he would use some to make biscuits and then feed the rest with flour and water to keep it alive for the next day. Beans, pinto beans or prairie strawberries, were another cornerstone of the diet. The cook would put a large pot of beans on to simmer all day, so they would be ready for the evening meal. Sobelly and beef. Salted pork, or sobelly, was the most common meat. Fresh beef was only available if a calf was injured and had to be slaughtered. A rare delicacy was son-of-a-gun stew, a concoction made from the less desirable parts of the calf. The heart, liver, tongue and marrow gut stewed for hours into a rich, greasy broth. Coffee. The coffee was always on. It was made in a huge pot and it was brutally strong. The cook would throw the grounds directly into the pot and boil it. When the pot was empty, he wouldn't clean it. He would just add more water and more grounds. By the end of the drive, the coffee was a thick, black sludge. The cook was also the camp doctor. His chuck box contained a rudimentary first aid kit with items like quinine for fever, castor oil for digestive issues, and carbolic acid as an antiseptic. He would set broken bones, stitch up wounds, and dispense rough medical advice. His remedies were often based more on folk wisdom than science, but he was the only medical professional the cowboys had. The chuck wagon and its cook were the anchor of the cowboy's world. It was the source of his food, his medicine, his news, and his sense of place. It was the one spot of domesticity and order in a universe of chaos. No matter how hard the day had been, the sight of the chuck wagon's campfire on the horizon at dusk meant safety, sustenance, and a moment of rest. A cowboy's survival truly depended on it. The Wild West is often portrayed as a lawless land, but the working cowboy lived by a strict, if unwritten, set of rules. This Code of the West was not a romantic notion of chivalry. It was a pragmatic and deeply functional system of ethics, born from the necessities of survival in a dangerous and interdependent environment. It was a social contract that governed a man's relationship with his fellow workers, his employer, and the harsh world around him. To break the code was to risk not just your reputation, but your life. The first and most important tenet was loyalty to the outfit and the brand. When a cowboy signed on for a drive, he was pledging his allegiance to the trail boss and the owner of the cattle. The brand was the symbol of that loyalty. His job was to get the owner's cattle to market, and his personal feelings or discomforts were secondary to that mission. A man who shirked his duties, who complained constantly, or who was not a team player, would quickly be ostracized and fired at the next opportunity. In the closed, mobile society of the trail, a bad reputation would follow you, making it difficult to find work again. Do your share of the work, and then some. Life on the trail was grueling, and everyone was expected to pull their weight. There was no room for laziness. A cowboy was expected to perform his duties without being told, to anticipate what needed to be done, and to willingly help a comrade in trouble. If another man's horse fell, you helped him. If a task required an extra hand, you offered yours. This mutual support was the glue that held the outfit together. Never steal from another man in the outfit. A cowboy's personal possessions were few but essential. His saddle, his rope, his bedroll, these were his livelihood. Stealing from a fellow cowboy was an unforgivable breach of trust. It was a violation of the sacred bond of the camp, and would result in immediate banishment from the crew, if not a more violent form of justice. Respect another man's horse. A man's horse, particularly his favorite mount, was an extension of himself. To ride another man's horse without his explicit permission was one of the gravest insults you could offer. It was a profound violation of his personal space and his professional identity. Don't complain. The litany of hardships on the trail was endless. The dust, the heat, the cold, the rain, the bad food, the saddle sores, the exhaustion. Complaining about these things was seen as a sign of weakness and poor character. Everyone was suffering. The expectation was that you would bear your hardships with a stoic silence, or at worst, a dry, dark sense of humour. A constant complainer, or bellyacher, eroded the morale of the entire crew. Tell the truth, a man's word was his bond. In a world with few written contracts, your reputation for honesty was everything. A man known to be a liar would not be trusted, and a man who could not be trusted was a danger to the whole outfit. Mind your own business. While the life was communal, there was also a strong respect for personal privacy, as limited as it was. You didn't ask a man about his past. Many men on the frontier were running from something, a failed business, a broken heart, or the law. It was considered polite to grant a man the dignity of his secrets. This code was not about abstract morality. It was a functional blueprint for cooperation. It ensured that a group of rough, independent, and heavily armed men could work together under extreme pressure without descending into chaos. It was a testament to the fact that even in the absence of formal laws and police, human beings will create their own systems of order to ensure the survival of the group. The Code of the West was the invisible framework that allowed the great cattle drives to function. For all the dangers posed by outlaws, hostile natives, or drunken disputes, the cowboy's most relentless and deadly adversary was nature itself. The weather and the landscape of the American West were forces of unimaginable power, and they killed far more cowboys than bullets ever did. A cowboy's survival depended less on his quick draw and more on his ability to read the sky, anticipate the terrain, and endure the brutal extremes of the elements. The sky. The weather on the Great Plains was a thing of violent, unpredictable mood swings. Thunderstorms. A prairie thunderstorm was a terrifying spectacle. The sky would turn a bruised, greenish, black. The lightning was not a distant flicker. It was a series of earth-shattering explosions that would light up the entire landscape. Lightning was one of the leading causes of death on the trail. A cowboy on horseback, a tall metal object in a flat landscape, was a natural lightning rod. The thunderclaps could also instantly trigger a cattle stampede, the single most feared event on a drive. Blizzards. In the Northern Territories or during late-season drives, a sudden blizzard could be a death sentence. The temperature could plummet in minutes. The air would fill with a blinding, disorienting wall of snow. A man could get lost just a few feet from the chuck wagon. The cattle would drift with the wind, sometimes piling up in ravines and suffocating. The cowboys, battling frostbite and hypothermia, would have to try to hold the herd together, a hopeless task against the overwhelming power of the storm. Heat and drought. The summer sun was a brutal, oppressive force. Heat stroke, what the cowboys called seeing the elephant, was a constant danger. The dust was a physical presence, coating everything, turning sweat into a muddy paste on the skin. Water was the most precious commodity. A trail boss had to know the location of every river, spring, and waterhole along the route. A miscalculation, finding a water source dried up, could mean disaster for both the men and the cattle. The land, the terrain itself was fraught with peril. River crossings. This was one of the most dangerous and nerve-wracking parts of any drive. A seemingly placid river could have a treacherous current or a bottom of quicksand. The cattle were often terrified of the water and had to be forced across. If the led steers panicked, they could turn back, causing a massive pile-up in the middle of the river. Cattle would be crushed or drowned. A cowboy whose horse lost its footing in the current could be swept away or dragged under by the weight of his own waterlogged chaps and boots. Prairie fires. In the dry season, a single spark from a campfire or a lightning strike could ignite the prairie grass, creating a terrifying wall of fire that moved faster than a galloping horse. The only defense was to try and outrun it, or to quickly burn a backfire, a patch of ground ahead of the main fire, creating a safe zone to shelter in. Stampedes. We have mentioned this before, but its danger cannot be overstated. It was the ultimate expression of the landscape's chaotic power. The ground would tremble, and the air would fill with a sound like thunder as thousands of panicked animals became an unstoppable, living avalanche. It was nature's fury, channeled through the bodies of the herd. A cowboy had to become a master naturalist. He had to learn to read the clouds, to smell rain on the wind, to know the signs of a coming storm. He had to understand the behavior of his cattle and the lay of the land. His survival depended not on conquering nature, but on showing it a profound and constant respect. His gun was useless against a blizzard. His horse could not outrun a prairie fire. In the face of nature's power, he was a small, fragile, and deeply humbled creature. In a life defined by physical hardship and constant danger, sickness and injury were not a matter of if, but when. For the cowboy on a long cattle drive, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, there was no doctor, no clinic, no medicine cabinet. The outfit's only medical professional was the cook, and the only hospital was a bedroll on the hard ground. Survival often came down to a combination of incredible toughness, folk remedies, and sheer, dumb luck. The most common ailments were a direct result of the work itself. Saddle sores. Hours upon hours in the saddle, combined with sweat and friction, led to painful, raw sores on a man's legs and backside. If these became infected, they could turn into a serious medical problem. Broken bones. A fall from a horse, a kick from a steer, or getting caught in a stampede could easily result in a broken bone. The cook would do his best to set the bone, using wooden splints made from a crate and bandages torn from a shirt. There was no painkiller, save for a large dose of whiskey. An improperly set bone could lead to a lifetime of pain and disability. A compound fracture, where the bone broke the skin, was almost always a death sentence due to the near certainty of infection. Wounds and infections. A cut from a branding iron, a gash from a barbed wire fence, or even a simple blister could become a life-threatening problem. In a world without antibiotics, any break in the skin was an open invitation for bacteria. The cook might clean the wound with whiskey or carbolic acid, but infection, or blood poisoning, was a constant and deadly threat. Internal illnesses were even more terrifying because they were invisible and mysterious. Trail fever, mountain fever. These were catch-all terms for any number of illnesses that caused high fevers. From tick-borne diseases like Colorado tick fever to typhoid, contracted from contaminated water. The only treatment was to try and sweat the fever out, keeping the patient hydrated if possible. Digestive ailments. The monotonous, greasy diet of beans and salt pork led to chronic digestive problems. Diarrhea, or the trots, was a common and miserable complaint. Pneumonia. Getting caught in a cold rain or a blizzard, followed by a night sleeping in damp clothes, could easily lead to pneumonia. With no way to fight the lung infection, it was often fatal. The cook's medical kit was primitive. It might contain quinine for fevers, a powerful laxative like castor oil, and some kind of salve or liniment for aches and wounds. Many of the remedies were based on folklore. A poultice of chewed tobacco might be applied to a snake bite. A hot compress of cow manure was sometimes used to draw out infection. These cures were often useless or even harmful. When a cowboy became too sick or injured to ride, the trail boss faced a difficult decision. The drive had to continue. The sick man might be placed in the chuck wagon, where he would endure a bumpy, agonizing ride. If he was too ill to be moved, he might be left at the nearest ranch or settlement, if one was within reach, with a portion of his wages to pay for his care. If he died on the trail, he was buried where he fell, his comrades pausing only for a brief, sad ceremony before pushing on. The physical toughness of these men is hard to comprehend. They worked through pain and illness that would send us to bed for a week. They had no other choice. To be sick or injured was to be a liability to the outfit. Survival depended on a body that could endure an astonishing amount of punishment, and an immune system that could fight off a constant barrage of threats. A cowboy's greatest asset was not his horse or his gun, but his own rugged, resilient, and ultimately disposable body. The brutal life of a cowboy was not just a physical trial, it was a profound psychological one. To endure the months of monotony, loneliness, and constant low-grade fear required a specific kind of mental fortitude. The inner world of the cowboy was as vast and often as desolate as the landscape he traversed. Monotony. The popular image of the cowboy life is one of constant action and adventure. The reality was that 99% of the time, it was mind, numbingly boring. It was the same slow, dusty routine, day after day, week after week. The landscape, while beautiful, was often unchanging for hundreds of miles. The work was repetitive. This crushing monotony could be as difficult to endure as any physical hardship. A man had to have a mind that was comfortable with long periods of silence and introspection. Loneliness. Despite being surrounded by his crewmates, the cowboy often experienced a deep sense of loneliness. The work itself was solitary. A man riding flank or drag spent most of his day alone with his thoughts. The relationships within the outfit were professional and often superficial. As we've seen, it was considered bad form to ask about a man's past, which meant that deep, personal connections were rare. The cowboy was part of a team, but he was often emotionally isolated within it. This loneliness was particularly acute at night, during the long, quiet hours of the night watch, with only the stars and the sleeping cattle for company. Fear. A cowboy lived with a constant awareness of death and danger. He learned to suppress his fear, to push it down beneath a stoic, unemotional exterior. To show fear was a sign of weakness that could erode the confidence of the entire crew. But the fear was always there, the fear of a stampede, of a swollen river, of a fall from a horse, of a sudden illness. This constant, suppressed anxiety took a psychological toll, manifesting in a kind of fatalism, a grim acceptance of the world's dangers. How did they cope? They developed a number of psychological survival mechanisms. Dark humor. Cowboy humor was notoriously dry, understated, and dark. They made jokes about the terrible food, the dangerous work, and the constant possibility of death. Humor was a way to diffuse tension and to make the unbearable bearable. A man might refer to a dangerous river as a little damp, or to a stampede as a bit of a run. This cynical wit was a shield against despair. Songs and stories. As we've seen, singing was a practical tool for calming the herd, but it was also a vital emotional outlet for the cowboys themselves. Around the campfire at night, after the work was done, men would tell stories, tall tales, jokes, and reminiscences of past drives. This was the primary form of entertainment, a way to build camaraderie and to escape, for a few hours, the monotony of their lives. The intense bond of the outfit. While personal friendships were sometimes shallow, the professional bond within the outfit was incredibly strong. These men depended on each other completely. They had faced life and death situations together. This shared experience created a powerful, unspoken loyalty, a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. A man might not know his bunkmate's last name, but he would risk his life to save him in a stampede without a second thought. This was the paradox of the cowboy's social world. Emotionally distant, but functionally intimate. The cowboy psyche was a product of its environment. It was stoic, pragmatic, and deeply resilient. It was a mind that had learned to find comfort in routine, to endure loneliness through quiet self-reliance, and to face down fear with a dry joke and an unshakable sense of duty to the men riding beside him. The sun has set on the prairie. The campfire has burned down to glowing embers. Our journey through the brutal, complex world of the working cowboy is at an end. We began with the myth of a man who survived with only his horse and his gun, and we have discovered a reality that is infinitely richer, harder, and more human. The cowboy's survival did not depend on two simple tools. It depended on an entire ecosystem of skill, equipment, and community. His horse was not one, but many, a string of specialists that he had to manage with expertise. His gun was not a symbol of his heroism, but a practical and infrequently used tool in a much larger kit that included his saddle, his rope, his hat, and his boots, each a piece of life-saving technology. But more than his gear, his survival depended on the human network that surrounded him. He was not a lone wolf. He was a member of the pack. He depended on the trail boss for leadership, on the wrangler for his horses, and most of all, on the cook and his chuck wagon for the sustenance and stability that made the entire enterprise possible. He survived because of the unwritten code that bound him to his fellow cowboys, a code of mutual support, shared labor, and stoic endurance. The true adversaries the cowboy faced were not bandits and outlaws. They were far more powerful and relentless. The crushing monotony of the trail, the explosive violence of the weather, the constant threat of sickness and injury, and the vast, soul-crushing loneliness of the landscape. He fought these battles not with his six-shooter, but with his sense of humor, his resilience, and his quiet determination to simply do the job. The era of the open-range cowboy was a brief, bright flash in the long history of the West, lasting little more than 20 years. It was a unique way of life, created by a specific set of economic and historical circumstances, and it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. But it left behind a myth so powerful that it has come to define our understanding of America itself. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the Hollywood image of the lone gunslinger fade away. Replace it with a more honest picture. A tired, dusty young man, surrounded by his comrades, singing softly to a herd of sleeping cattle under a vast, star-filled sky. He is not a hero. He is a laborer. He is not a symbol of rugged individualism, but a testament to the power of collective effort. His story is not about the glory of the gun, but about the quiet, uncelebrated triumph of enduring one more day in a beautiful and brutal world.